I'm Ken Rockwell. This presentation stems from my work as a librarian at the University of Utah. The J. Willard Marriott Library has been digitizing many of its unique historical resources, and they range from pioneer diaries to maps to manuscripts to century-old photographs, making them available for free on the internet. My job involves metadata, providing information about these resources so as to make them more accessible to users. Among our sets of historical photos is the Newell Beeman collection. Newell Beeman was a retired businessman in Salt Lake City who, in the second decade of the 20th century, made a hobby of photographing older buildings in the area, including churches. And that gave me an idea. At the Marriott, we've been recently producing online exhibits to introduce users to diverse resources in our digital library. So I thought I might create an exhibit highlighting photos by Beeman and others that display the history of religious diversity in the city through its architecture. It can involve new photos showing the church buildings of a century ago as they appear today. So I began to go out and take photos for this exhibit with this exhibit in mind, and then conceived of the idea of a major new collection of such photos, a sort of centennial update to Beeman's project. It could include buildings that weren't around back then and reflect the growing religious diversity of the city. While Beeman usually had only one photo of a building, I resolved to take multiple photos for showing from various angles for those interested in architectural detail. So let's take a whirlwind tour of Salt Lake's changing religious landscape. I'll include historical photos by Beeman and others. And of course, how it all began with the coming of the pioneers in 1847. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints began building meeting houses early on, often using adobe. Its Salt Lake Temple, no doubt, is our most famous religious building, begun in 1853, but it took 40 years to finish. Many of the old ward houses are gone now, replaced by newer structures. The oldest survivor is the 1873 ward house of the old 10th Ward at 8th East and 4th South. Unfortunately, Beeman focused on its replacement and neglected the original, still standing just to the north. You can barely see the edge of it there. The building is now used for other purposes, other activities within the ward. Beeman also missed this one, the old 2nd Ward meeting house on 7th South, which dates from 1883. And from the looks of its condition, I'm wondering how long this building is going to remain. Latter-day Saints had a monopoly on religious architecture, religious structures for nearly 20 years. But with the coming of the U.S. Army to Camp Douglas in the 1860s and a corresponding contingent of non-Mormon civilians, this was soon to change. The camp commander, Patrick Connor, was a Roman Catholic, and he arranged for visiting Catholic priests to preach the first sermons at the camp and to minister to civilian Catholics in the area. But it would take some time before the Catholics had their own buildings. A congregational minister named Norman MacLeod became the Protestant chaplain at Camp Douglas, and in January of 1865, he began to preach in downtown for civilians. The Protestants in town soon gathered funds to construct a meeting house in 1866, which they dubbed Independence Hall. They all met together under MacLeod's ministry, and this is considered the beginnings of the Congregational Church in Utah. I've been asked just where this historic building was located. So here's an 1889 map from our Sanborn collection, which is also online. It shows the Congregational Church as it was in 1889 in the block bounded by 300 South on the north and Main Street on the east. An aerial view of the same block today shows that it's only a parking lot now. As more people who identified with different Protestant traditions arrived, they started their own congregations and were soon building their own church buildings. For example, the Episcopalians, whose St. Mark's Cathedral ranks as Salt Lake's second oldest existing house of worship, and the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, they all created their own homes, and eventually only the Congregationalists were left in Independence Hall, and they too built a new church in 1890, after which the old one was torn down. The Catholic community built their first church, St. Mary Magdalene, on 2nd East, opened in 1871. It was in use until 1909, when the Cathedral of the Magdalene was completed on South Temple. I'd also like to mention two chapels associated with major institutions in town. The Fort Douglas Chapel was built in 1884, and while decommissioned when the fort ceded most of its land to the University of Utah, it has been restored and is used by student religious groups, so that it qualifies as the fourth oldest house of worship still standing in the city. Similarly, the Catholic Chapel of Holy Cross Hospital, dedicated in 1904, has outlasted its institution. Holy Cross became Salt Lake Regional Medical Center, but the chapel has been preserved and restored. And late breaking news, the hospital has changed hands again and has once again become Holy Cross Hospital. That's interesting late development. A Jewish community was here early as well, and by 1884 they had built a school where they held meetings for a few years until they built a new synagogue in 1891. B'nai Israel became associated with Reform Judaism, and in 1903 a second synagogue, Montefiore, opened to serve those of the conservative movement. The two groups eventually reunited and built a new synagogue, Congregation Kol Ami, which stands in the southeast corner of the city. With increased immigration, the country was becoming more diverse, and this is true of Utah as well. So numerous churches accommodated the language needs of newly arrived immigrants. The Tabor Lutheran Church in the Avenues district used Danish until the 1930s. The Greek community established Orthodox churches in the late 19th century. This older church on the left was replaced by the larger Holy Trinity Cathedral. Japanese immigrants arrived in the early 20th century and established a vibrant Japantown on First South, just west of Main Street. A Christian church co-sponsored by the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians was built in 1918, which survived the death of Japantown and was celebrating its centennial when I took this picture on the right. Meanwhile, Japanese Buddhists built a temple, now long gone, but replaced by a modern complex nearby. A group of Russian Latter-day Saints immigrated and occupied the old 19th ward and had a meeting house built that included elements of Russian architecture. A major reason for the changing religious landscape is that a church would outgrow its building and relocate to new quarters. This happened a lot through the 20th century, as with the Danish Lutherans. Calvary Baptist Church, an African-American congregation, has been very successful in its growth over the years and was already in its second home when Beeman took a picture a century ago. Now they're in their fourth location. There was considerable movement eastward, and congregations moved out of downtown as the East Bench grew up in mid-century. Wasatch Presbyterian was built following a merger of two Presbyterian congregations in 1946, Westminster and Third Presbyterian. And when church buildings were vacated, what happened to them? Some were repurposed for other uses, not all of them religious. And a classic example is the downtown Baptist church that now houses an antique store. Another congregational church on 7th East closed in 1950 and has housed various businesses over the years, including an office interiors building or store in 2018. This business is gone, and I've been watching to see what the next use of this building will be. Another old church, which began as an English-speaking Lutheran congregation, was for many decades the home of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the RLDS community, now known as the Community of Christ. They moved out in the 50s, and it has housed numerous restaurants in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Then it was vacant by 2018, and unfortunately that building has been torn down just last year, I believe. One of the old synagogues downtown has been an office interiors store for years now. They have done a great job in preserving its interior, including the stained glass windows. Speaking of synagogues, when I was researching old buildings, I learned of another one built for a short-lived congregation of Yiddish-speaking Jews. After they dissolved in the 1930s, it became a Veterans of Foreign Wars post for a while, and now it's an architect's office. Another hidden gem I learned of is this building, now an artist's residence and studio. It was built as a Seventh-day Adventist church and later became the home of a group called the Full Gospel Assembly. This group seems to have folded in the 1990s. The LDS Church also got in on the repurposing as they built newer facilities. The old 24th Ward on 2nd West, 700 North dates from 1907. Vacated in 1969, it now houses the Garbett Center for Choral Music. But a more common fate these days is that an old meeting house gets torn down and replaced on adjacent space. The old site often becomes a parking lot, as in the case of the 18th Ward meeting house between A and B streets in the avenues. A pretty old chapel dismantled in 1973 and replaced by the new meeting house in the background. Such an architectural loss. But wait, something different happened in this instance. After it was dismantled, the old chapel was reconstructed on Capitol Hill and is now known as the White Memorial Chapel. It's used for special events, including weddings and interfaith services. Some startup churches have held their services there before finding other homes. Repurposing can go the other way as well. There are also a number of buildings built for secular purposes that have since been remodeled as houses of worship. Among them, this former Salt Lake Public Library at 776 West, 200 North, built in 1921 and closed in 1965. It now houses the Free Church of Tonga. The Islamic community was quite resourceful in remodeling an old bank branch on North Temple into a mosque. And this Vietnamese Buddhist temple on 700 West would never be mistaken for the private residence it once was. This house on 1700 South still fits into the residential neighborhood, but since around 1991, it has been a meeting house for the local members of the Baha'i faith. Using houses as churches is an old tradition. This house at 825 South, 600 East was in Beeman's day a mission house for the Swedish Baptist Church and has had several occupants since. Today, it's a branch of the Metropolitan Community Church. It was interesting to learn that after the Hotel Utah was remodeled for offices as the Joseph Smith Memorial Building, an old grand ballroom was converted into a chapel that is now used by 2 downtown wards. Also common is for vacated church houses of worship to become the homes of other religious groups. An evangelical free church on 7th East, after several other tenants and remodels, has been a mosque since the 1980s. Another old church building downtown, previously First Church of Christ Scientist, is now a Spanish-speaking congregation. The old Montefiore Synagogue downtown has been used by various churches and is currently an Orthodox church. The former 5th Ward meeting house on 3rd West had by 2018 become the home of a Tibetan Buddhist group. but they have moved out since then, and I am still waiting to learn what the next use for this building is going to be. It seems to be vacant right now. Another remodel on 700 West, a Pentecostal holiness church, has become a mosque for immigrants from Bosnia. A really nice remodeling job. Another aspect I've noticed in all of this change is that when churches moved out, they often took along parts of their former home and incorporated it into the new building. Zion Lutheran Church, which moved from downtown to the East Bench in 1956, took along an old bell that now resides in its own tower. The old 15th Ward Meeting House, built in 1904, included a pulpit dating from the 1850s, transplanted from the old First Ward building. The present owner, the Utah Arts Alliance, has carefully preserved it and other elements of the building. And then there's First Congregational Church, which was at 4th South or 400 East and 1st South, moved to Foothill Boulevard in 1965 and took along a historical stained glass window, as well as a pipe organ dating from the 1890s. An update, First Congregational Church sold its building in 2022 and moved to smaller quarters, but they've made arrangements for preserving the stained glass window. It will be incorporated into a new LDS temple. The historic organ was given to the Provo Community Church, which is undergoing renovation, and its sanctuary pews have gone to Wabash Presbyterian for their current renovation. The building itself will likely be demolished. And Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church at 1100 East was built in 1913 and included the altar that was salvaged from the old St. Mary Magdalene Church downtown. This building, too, is reportedly slated to close, and I hope they make arrangements to preserve that altar once more. It's a difficult time for some shrinking congregations, but some of the old churches continue on in downtown Salt Lake, including First Methodist, now overshadowed by high-rises. And new groups keep popping up, including evangelical-oriented planted churches. They often started out in rented facilities, and if they're particularly successful, they may buy their own building, perhaps repurposing another old church, as Gospel Grace did there at 13th South. A few other examples of older buildings that have preservation issues. The old 29th Ward Chapel still stands on the west side, abandoned. There has been talk of renovating it as a community center, but that work seems to have stalled for the time being. Another old meeting house, the 16th Ward building, has been a private residence, and was slated to be repurposed as a youth club before I photographed it in 2018. By October of 2018, it had been razed, the new owners deciding it was too expensive to retrofit for current safety standards. That's the same argument being used in the case of the old Wells Ward meeting house. The LDS Church has it up for sale with the condition that it must be torn down. Now, I'd like to mention a few limits I placed on the scope of my project. To start, there are so many Latter-day Saint ward houses in town. I chose not to include everyone, concentrating on the older ones, which have interesting architecture. But some of those ward houses are nonetheless in the collection as they got repurposed as the homes of other churches. Another limit I placed was not to include every temporary home in an otherwise secular building, though I do include a few examples. And I decided not to include every site that used to have a church and now has been entirely removed. There are plenty of those, and I'm trying to keep this project under control, to a reasonable size. That's also why I kept it limited to the borders of Salt Lake City. I actually had taken these pictures along 21st South before I realized that the city boundary runs right down 21st South, and these are actually outside the scope of Salt Lake City. So I didn't include them in the original project. And I could have gone out of town. Beeman did. He went as far south as Sandy and up into Davis County, photographing various buildings. One of them down in Murray has had a nice repurposing from a Methodist church a century ago to the home of the Quakers today. My biggest regret in sticking to the confines of Salt Lake City is how it leaves out some important traditions that contribute to the religious diversity of the area. While the city has several mosques and Buddhist temples, the Sikh and Hindu traditions from India have their main buildings out in other cities. A closing note for this whirlwind tour, here's another building that looked a bit forlorn when I visited in July of 2018. It was built for the new Pilgrim Baptist Church and had several occupants, but seemed to be abandoned at the time or under reconstruction, perhaps. I wasn't sure, but I noticed an open window and decided to take a peek. And I saw, with a bit of irony, this biblical quote speaking of things eternal in a site of obvious change. And I think that reflects, in a nutshell, the changing religious landscape of Salt Lake City. Nearly 150 years of change as reflected by its physical buildings. Who knows what the next century will bring? Will someone 100 years from now do an update, even as I did 100 years after Newell Beeman? I like to think so. Now that's where my presentation ended when I gave it for various groups and conferences in 2019. I wanted to reach out to others in the community, including faith groups, so I contacted the Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable late in 2019, and that led to a very interesting change of plans. One of the roundtable members, a leader in the Hindu community, was interested in sharing photos of a new Hindu temple in South Jordan. That was way beyond Salt Lake's boundaries, and I could easily have said, thanks, but no thanks. But I didn't. Instead, I got the idea that, maybe others would be willing to share their photos. We could do a crowdsourcing project. So I talked that over with my colleagues, and we put together a way for people to submit their own photos, a form which they can attach several photos at a time to. And so we launched a new project, the Utah Religious Architecture Photo Collection. It went live in early 2020, just in time for the pandemic. Not the best of timing, but I produced some flyers like this one with a URL to reach the homepage for the project, and I've had occasion to hand them out and share them with people. And there has been modest success getting images from various parts of the state, including Moab, Richfield, Delta, but we still have a lot of ground to cover. Ogden, Logan, St. George, Price, none of them are represented yet. Any photographers out there watching this, I would love to see what you have. That includes new photos from Salt Lake City. I'm adding Latter-day Saints sites that I had neglected in the 2018 project. And as Salt Lake City's religious landscape continues to evolve, we can add updates in the new project. For example, the new Pilgrim Baptist, let's see. Yeah, that's what, I seem to have left something out. Yeah. Yeah, the new Pilgrim Baptist Church has been replaced by the building you see on the right that the Seventh-day Adventists raised just last year. Also in my 2018 project, I was almost exclusively doing exterior shots. So I'm aiming to include interior views in the current project. And so